I want when you're talking about content and form, I want to go back to collage, especially in terms of memory and being, because if we think about Romeo Bearden, if we think of other artists who have, used collage, um, memory is in fact embedded in that. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about content, process, form in relation to myth and memory and how you are using it in these works, because you're not only using it in a literal sense, by piecing together different images. You have created those images. You're recomposing them. And you're also using collage in different ways. Whether you're doing the collage paintings, you're doing collage in a sense when you are making the landscape images, you are using collage. Collage becomes almost fundamental, I think, to this particular show, even with the sculpture. We can even take.
I wrote was that even with the sculpture, that it also connects to collage.
Yes, yes, yes. I think I want you to talk a little bit about collage as process, but also collage as a process with its own content when it comes to mobilizing your engagement with it in this particular body of work, and bringing to bear all of the what how you mobilize memory through it.
Okay. So, yeah, collage is definitely become a part of my practice, but I think it's also because the same connection you were talking about with history and fragmentation and the silences. So even when you think about an archive is a collage. It's a collage of different letters, and it's usually maybe one or several people kind of deciding what they're going to piece together and reconstitute to create this history. So in many ways, that's also what I'm doing. When you're thinking, for example, about the digital collage series, that's something that's coming from images that I'm taking at different beaches. I'm using my own body, and I'm piecing it together to create this kind of new landscape, this new environment. Collage and painting, collage works that are here in this larger room and in the other room. Because of the way that the series has developed, it's both thinking about the material as memory, right? The paper as this artifact that holds memory. So, for example, when I started working with the ripping element in this work, it was after Hurricane Maria and Irma, my studio was damaged, and I almost threw the paper away because we think about paper as this kind of pristine object that you're only supposed to work on it if it's still nice and bright and clean and pristine, and the paper was stained and crackling and ripping as I tried to use it. But then Michael, actually, a mutual colleague and friend, reminded me that the longer your practice deals with archive, this is an archive for the storm. You should just use it. And so that's when I started really thinking about using that, and almost, actually Michael was here. He gave me a really beautiful Mike Walsh comment at the show at the opening that I really appreciated. He was almost like, you kind of like disrespect the material a little bit in the ways that I'm using the paper, and because even in the ways that I'm using the paper as this vehicle to kind of create a new landscape, create a new history, thinking about what is monumental. Obviously, if you're working with the art in very much thinking about monumentality in very different ways. That it's not just about encasing something in a large bronze sculpture, but the different ways that things can be monumental in the sense that there are these things that encapsulate history, language, memory, myth, all in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I've been thinking a lot about when I've been making this work. in some ways, monuments are also maps, and so this work has a very graphical feel as well. And I'm thinking about how do I, collage and piece together the different, not just histories, but even the way that I'm using color, which for a long time, my work was color lights, I would say. I didn't really, I was thinking much more about the complexities of the ideas I was working with, but for this work, as you can see, I've been about color as memory even as well. Like, sometimes things look like sunsets, they look like conch shells, they look like, these old images that we see of the Caribbean and these lithographs that were created, they look like parts of the rocks on the shoreline. They look like storms. It's also kind of piecing together like the map of all the different things that I see and experience as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they're also really, trying to make very intentional registers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With the kinds of mark making, with the cuts and burns that I've been making.
Yeah, yeah. I find I've become obsessed with paper in recent weeks and months. And one of the discoveries I made was that a lot of the colonial archives would not be possible without the sort of the increase in the production of paper in colonial centers, like all of the things that they held there in colonial spaces, and what they archived and how they archived was dependent on paper. And in a way, even though you may not have been thinking about that part of the history, for me, the work holds that history just because of its materiality, right? It gestures towards that history, and I think that's an important element when you try to think about ways in which artists, just how publics think and audiences think about the ways that artists are thinking. Many artists like Levon really are thinking through their materials, all of the decisions that they're making in terms of the work, the structure of the work, the materials, etc. A lot of it has meaning, and it goes back to what the work is, in a sense, about, but also what they are trying to get you as an audience member to think about. And one of the things that I learned in working with Levon really is the richness of history that is held in the landscapes of St. Croix. And one of the things that evolved in the process of preparing for this show was this came out of this amazing story she told to me, and then I read everything about it because I was so taken by it in the sculpture she created. And I want you to, in a sense, Levon, can you talk about that sculpture in terms of collage, but also in terms of material, and also in terms of what it gestures towards historically and in our present? If you can use that sculpture, talk about that sculpture as a way to link various aspects of your practice together through it.
Okay, so now I get to talk about the sculpture.
Now you can talk about it, yeah.
Okay. Well, when I was thinking about the show, a lot of my exhibitions, I try to always investigate something new and to push myself to do something new. So this was that for me. And the first time I ever heard this story, growing up here, of course, we all know about Columbus landing sites. Some of us have probably been there. Maybe not all of us have actually been out in the water and been able to take the kayak tours that they do. But the first time I was ever able to do that, it made me see that space, just the embodiment of being a bioluminescent being. It's a very magical place, a very unique place. It's one of the few places in the world that has this kind of plankton and algae up with disturbance and as a way of their own defense mechanism, which is such a beautiful metaphor when you think about this idea of the first encounters that happened there between Columbus and his men and Caminando, the entire people, many people out there. But there's a detail that shows up in the archives. You know, we've all heard that it's called he called it the Peak of Arrows because they had a violent interaction. There's killed. But there was a time that I had done this kayak tour where the tour guide mentioned that he gave a little more details, where he mentioned that there were 4 people in a canoe that got turned over, and that 2 of them were women. And so they, as their canoe got overturned, they were there fighting, swimming, and shooting arrows in water. And that image really, really struck me. Partly because of my own experience being a swimmer. I was a competitive swimmer for many years, and so I really understood, like, it's nice, you know, to be able to be swimming and shooting arrows and be able to that idea, and it just there was something also about the skill of that, like what kind of life would produce the agility to do that, that I just was also quite fascinated with, right? And at first, David and we went out there, and I was thinking maybe I wanted to do a photographic project. And this kind of opens you up a little bit of how I think, because I thought, this image I want to capture, maybe it is me in the water. Maybe it's a video, you know, maybe it's something, but me there somehow. So we went out there, scouted, and had some tests. And eventually I realized that that's not quite the direction I wanted to go. And then I thought, well, maybe it would be better if I did a sculpture that was made out of paper pulp and also the soil from that area. And then I could kind of fashion something from that very landscape. And then, of course, as we're thinking a lot about archives, you know, when I was able, I just went back to one places that shred paper. And so it's kind of this archive for all kinds of different types of paper. And what I love about this project in particular is because a lot of the paper is laminated. It shows up, you can still see it. You know, you see like this little pink or turquoise or even a little plastic actually that shows up in the work. And so there was something about that stance of, you know, the arrow and like this kind of defense, this image that's actually quite ancient, right? Like one of these very ancient images that we've seen across many, many cultures of this arrow. That I wanted to capture. And then, as you know, the glass came quite late. And I think the sculpture was probably almost here when I realized that I always wanted to figure out how to capture the bioluminescent part of the work, but or to bring that somehow into the story. So we thought a lot about glowing paint, glowing light, like, you know, trying to kind of come up with something, but when I was dropping my kids to school, there was a car accident, and there was this sea of glass that on the road that I realized that's it. That's actually, I think, what I would use. And then there was something really beautiful when you think about this kind of refraction as this kind of ocean bed that this figure is coming out of. So there were a lot of elements when I was in the way that this work kind of converged into being.
Yeah, and of course, I was struck by the fact that this work could lead me down this path of research onto this into this event because I had never heard of it, and for me, the work stimulated that research, right? It led me into finding out more about it, and in a sense, it became a place where, for me as an art historian, I could see the entire battle unfold, right? And it's the first instance in history where we see we see the Taino people fighting back. You know, they're generally historicized as very humble and very, you know, kind and very opening. But here in this event that is embodied in that sculpture, which that sculpture gestures towards, what we see is an alternative archive. what we see you pointing to is an alternative story, an alternative way for us to, in a sense, view or draw on that experience. And that upends the sort of neat tale that provides just enough room. The work provides just enough room in our thinking through its materiality, through its references, through the gesture that you encompass in it, to, in a sense, destabilize the monument that can be an archive, right? And in a way, the work is doing its work through the form itself. And I really embrace that. But this show, in a very strong way, is about landscape art in a way. You really turn to the landscape in a very meaningful way here. And I want you to talk about that. Can you tell us a little bit about the way you see landscape as archive in a sort of troubling post-colonial space where, as you have written about, memory is constantly disappearing because we have been separated from our archival past.
Yeah, I would also say memory is constantly reappearing in a way. Here we have this phenomenon. It's everywhere really in the Americas, but we actually have a name for it, which is called chaining, which is colonial shards of pottery that keep resurfacing after a hard rain, or you find them in the gutters, you find them at the beach. And I think it's really interesting the fact that here we have a name for it. When I first started seeing them or really paying attention to them at my studio, I would sometimes, step outside or come to my studio and I would find shards of colonial era pottery from the 1700s, just greeting me, remembering like, hey, it's like this refusal to be forgotten. And if you know anything about our relationship with Denmark, they've done a lot of this kind of unremembering of their colonial history. And so in that way, it makes me think a lot about, that's one way that the landscape literally is like giving this offering of memory. But we have it, of course, in other ways here, because I'm St. Croix, I think it's very, very unique. I've traveled a lot of places in the Caribbean. They don't have this preponderance of sugar mills like how we do here. I mean, you see sugar mills at the shopping center, you see it at the beach, you see it when you're having your kids at soccer practice. You see sugar, we have schools in them, we have churches in them, we have hotels in them. I think that's very, very unique. I've never seen it anywhere else. And that's another way that they're almost like keloids on the landscape, right? These kinds of scars to this history. I also think about it, when we think about, for example, trees like the baobab tree. These trees that are centuries old. And again, St. Croix is very unique. Out of the entire Caribbean study we've done, we have the most baobab trees in the Caribbean. There are almost 100. And, these things that come out of Western Africa that are here, and they've been witnesses to so much of our history. And I think about it also, every hurricane season, when we're thinking about what happens to the landscape, when storms come, when hurricanes come, this kind of, the ways that the landscape is constantly being transformed. And I've been thinking a lot about the landscape almost as a kind of both maybe almost like an active participant in building the history. There's actually a really beautiful quote that Tiffany, I need to find it, who's a writer from the Virgin Islands. She has this beautiful quote that talks a lot about history being, the land actually is an active participant in creating history. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. So you'll see it, the land through the horizon line, through the storm, land, body. That's definitely a through line throughout the exhibition. I've been, especially the show that I just did, And in South Carolina, the work that I developed there, I had really started thinking about, when we think about land, it's not just the like earth and sand. It's been thinking about the insects and the birds, and, like land is maybe encompassing a little bit more of the natural world, and how, what if that is an active participant in the rebellion against colonialism? Because when I think a lot about how, for example, when I was in South Carolina, and you look out at the marshes, and it looks like this like very pristine, beautiful landscape, but it's actually one of the most manipulated landscapes in the United States from enslaved labor. And how, when I did a lot of research about like the minutia of rice plantation systems and how they had to deal with different kinds of insects and birds, and you can't plant at this time because this bird is gonna swoop down and take the insect. Like, it started to make me realize like the land was rebelling too, because they had developing all these systems to deal with nature. But so I've been thinking a lot about those things when I think about being a colonial being. I mean, we don't live in a post-colonial reality. We live still in a colonial reality in our relationship with the United States. So it's been thinking a lot about how do we look to the land to employ systems of being.
What do you think about memory in terms of in post-colonial spaces or formerly colonized spaces? Maybe not completely post, but formerly colonized and maybe presently colonized spaces. Do you think, why do we need to remember? And I ask this because in other parts of the Caribbean, I know that colonial history is the relationship with current the current population and colonial history is very fraught, and some people advocate that we don't need to remember. It's a place of trauma that we need to forget. But your work seems to, in a sense, push against that a little bit. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the value that you see in memory, but also the work of your work in terms of the need perhaps to remember or to formulate new memories, as you mentioned a few moments ago, and how those new memories, in a sense, relate to what you're drawing up in order to help us forge those new memories by looking at the past.
Thanks for that question. I mean, I think I would probably, I began to understand it before my mother was sick, but having a mother live and die of Alzheimer's was so profound in terms of the way that I think about who we really are as a human being. Because, when people think about Alzheimer's, they think it's like, oh, I don't remember someone's name. But it's way beyond that. It's like, I don't remember what water feels like. So when water touches my skin, I'm scared. It's like, it's memory on such a deep level that it really, that's all we are. It's made me really understand, like, that's all we are. Like, all we are is the things that we can remember, and then the stories that we tell, which in some ways are very similar, right? The mythology, who we say we are. My name is, that's a myth. I'm not Vaughn. That's just like it's a story I say about who I am, right? It's encapsulated in this 2-syllable name. And so that was like a very, very profound experience for me. But when I think about, a place like the Virgin Islands, or even, I'll also say there's a really beautiful passage in Jamaica Communicates, in the small place, where she talks about the Caribbean and says like that we have this thing with time, where we'll talk about something that happened 200 years ago as if it's today, and then some things that are happening today, it's like we don't even pay much attention to. I think there's an interesting relationship that we have with time. that I think has a lot to do with the trauma, the histories of trauma. And so I think that when we recognize that we come out of these histories, then memory work is healing work.
Mhm.
And so for my practice, it's also healing work, right? It's about trying to, it's understanding that how powerful the stories that we say about who we are as Virgin Islanders, as Black people, or people from African diaspora, as Caribbean people, like whatever it is that we're saying about who we are, I think that there's room for a retelling that leads us to a future that's more empowered. And it doesn't necessarily mean, for example, like, I mean, I Am Queen Mary is a really good example of that, right? That's an allegorical portrait of Queen Mary. I mean, it's not a historical monument, it's not a monument that centers in a narrative of one person, even though we title it I Am Queen Mary, it's a much more open process. And so much of that work was, as you said, it's like let the work do the work. And just in the same way that you felt inspired in thinking about this work to find out more about the story of that encounter, that happened too with I Am Queen Mary. That people were so inspired to find, well, what does Queen Mary really look like? Where is she buried? It was like, it helped to generate, it inspired that same sense of knowledge and knowing and wanting to understand the story better. But what I always find so interesting about the narrative of the Fireman is that, when we're confronted with the colonial archive, and we all know that the colonial archive is still fraught, it's still incredibly biased, there's still lots of holes, but there's still some things that are so-called facts, right? We can know like where someone lived on the island. We know, if an event actually occurred more or less. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the things that we say about the Fire One, we imagine that it's 3 women that somehow maybe were gathered in a sugarcane field and decided to create this rebellion together as a collective unit, where the archival evidence suggests that they may not have even known each other. The archival evidence suggests that contrary stories to even their admitting their participation, right? There's testimony of Queen Mary denying her participation in the fire line, denying that she was the leader. And I mean, that of course complicates, these kinds of stories complicate basically the narrative that we choose to remember. So if we have an oral history narrative and then there's a narrative that's written down, which one is true? And so for me, I started to realize like there's truth in probably both stories, but the most important thing is the story that we need to tell for ourselves, right? So it makes sense that Denmark would tell a narrative of a woman who was a child abuser, who was duplicitous, because that's the story that they need to tell about the power of the women who grew up to counter that. But we also need to tell the story of 3 women before possibly coming together to collectively defy the colonial establishment. And so I started to really over the last several years realize that we tell the stories that we need to tell. And that's all that really matters. That's all that really matters. We tell the stories that we need to tell. And so it's made me, I think I've been, I've been deeply inspired by archives and research, but I think I've learned that we hold tremendous narrative authority, even as an artist, that you hold a kind of a narrative authority that can counter colonial narratives.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And let's talk about that. Let's keep that let's keep that those comments in mind when I'm looking at the audience and I'm seeing that work on the back wall, one of the paper collages. And that collage, it has a life. It has a, you know, it has a, there's something almost um it catalyzes with the form. It has its own life in it, but it's not a square. It's not a very neat sort of finished piece of paper, you know, where work has been done on it. It has taken a particular kind of form. Am I am I overthinking it when I think that the form itself, in a sense, speaks back to the sort of unfinished nature of what you were just saying, and the whole idea of process itself? That
Yeah.
it's not contained, or am I reading too much into your decisions as an artist and in terms of just making these works that do not have clear ends or even beginnings?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think I appreciate that observation. Because of course I have thought about making them more rectangular, more to look almost like a map or more the ways that we see painting. And I've decided to move much more in the opposite direction, them having like their own life. Um, Very much in the same way that islands are created, right? Like our borders are constantly shifting, constantly changing. Um, that it isn't static. Um, and even the conception of what an island is really kind of like this fabrication. So I've been thinking a lot about that and in terms of especially with this one. I think this is one of the last ones where you're starting to see entrails or maybe I mean they're like part root, part octopus, leg part. I mean, it feels like a lot of different things that are kind of squiggling and emanating, and it almost feels like it could keep moving. Some of these things that you just see that start moving, and I'm not sure how they're moving, but they're moving across the wall, maybe. Um, so yeah, I think that's a good observation. That for me, it's true that you're not sure where the work began or how it ended. I will say the way that in terms of the process and the way that I make this work is significant. A lot of my work is like that, where it starts from small fragments,
Hmm.
and so that shifts. And so where I begin, that could end up being the far left. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the center moving out. Because sometimes I cut the work up, I rearrange it, when I feel like it's finished, it's usually I say when I don't have much curiosity about it anymore. Meaning like I'm not I'm not constantly thinking of what if and what else and what like when that subsides, then I'm like, okay, it's
Hmm. Hmm. So when Lavon and I started, when Lavon contacted me and invited me to be a part of this show, I asked for things to read. I asked her to give me a few titles. You know, how do I start to even enter your work? Please give me a few things to read and let me start there. And she gave me this incredible text that she had been working on for the last few years. But she also gave me pointed to a few authors that I simply loved, right? And I'm like, oh my God, she's reading what I'm reading. We're reading like similar things. We're being stimulated by similar ways of thinking about the Caribbean, about the post colonial, about memory, about the present. And two of the authors that that really resonated with her and in a sense she told me has shaped her practice really their writings have shaped her practice were Audre Lorde and Michelle Trujillo. And Audre Lorde, of course, is an incredible Black feminist writer who was of Caribbean parentage, but was born and grew up in the United States. But she chose to come to St. Croix after she found out she had cancer. She spent the last several years of her life on that island. And that choice to return to that island has always sat with me for a very, I've thought about that choice to return to that space when in the midst of knowing that you're going to die, that's where you want to live, that you choose to live in that space. And I'm not sure are we able to do this? Are we able to ask audience members to read a portion?
Oh, I can pull it up and see if it's
So this is your assignment audience, those that are gathered. We're going to ask members of the audience to read an excerpt, Audre Lorde's poem, a poem from Audre Lorde, and also an excerpt from the Trio text. And we're not going to put anyone on the spot per se, but we do want to hear from you in terms of where what might these words stimulate in you? Like, what's your response to the text? And then I want Lavon to talk about the ways in which these particular writings, the work of these particular Caribbean artists and thinkers have shaped her practice as well.
All right, so looking for a volunteer, I'll have you read it on the microphone. It's the first stanza of a poem by Audre Lorde called A Litany for Survival.
I can walk the mic and the phone around and nobody just so standing and talking to someone with the battery.
You think I have to come? Yeah.
Anyone?
Don't be shy.
Anyone?
I'm just gonna pick somebody. So because I know you are. Yeah, you got to live from the future. For those of us who live at the shoreline, A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live in the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways and coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can bring futures. Anyone know that word? It's a poem that's called a litany, and litanies are almost a recitation of grievances, right? And so when I think about her, I think she wrote that poem around in the 1970s, and there's a lot in the poem that's basically talking about this. Usually in the litany, there's also a part that's repeated, and the line that she repeats a lot is, "We were never meant to survive." And for me, when I think about us being here on these spaces in the Caribbean, these rocks, I'm always reminded of that. That we were not meant to survive. That even up until, not that long ago, the mortality rate on St. Croix in the early 1900s, when we just after the transfer, when the U.S. Navy was sent here, then they had done a study of the people that were here, and the mortality rate was 50%. And when you think about that, I mean, they actually called it a genocide that was happening. So I've always been, but at the same time, when you know something about Audre Lorde, she talks a lot about the power of writing, the power of living, the power of embodied experience, the power of joy, the power of love, but especially the power of controlling your narrative, which is also very much inspiring the show, and the ways that I'm thinking through a lot of the elements of the show. I don't know if anyone else maybe wants to share anything that they were inspired by. Thought about when they hear that word. Is that the first time maybe some people have heard that word? Yeah. And you said you're inspired by her. What inspires you about her?
The way she sees, the way she's always seen the world. I always felt as if she had a third eye or she had a higher consciousness for the way, for seeing what it was that was before us and what we needed to do, you know? It's not just a litany in a way, right? It's a litany, but it's also telling us what we need to do in a way. She's illuminating, even as she is teaching. She's illuminating a path forward in through the work, and I think it goes back to what you just said, that writing for her was a kind of pathway. I wouldn't say to freedom, but definitely for life. And for me, Audre Lorde was about life, and when I think of the decision to come, we sort of underestimate the Caribbean in so many different ways, right? We tend to drain out its vitality into the sun, sea, and sand concept. But what I think your work and the work of many contemporary artists who engage the past, what you're doing is really painting a different picture, telling us about the complexity of this space that has been disregarded by the archive in a particular way, or made to be seen as a space to be disregarded or to be taken in a particular way. And what you're doing is, in a sense, drawing a different picture, giving us the kind of complexity, the space, the kind of complexity that it definitely needs. So, in a sense, what she is doing through her work, what you do through your work, is to
Okay, we're talking about the complexity of the space, and we have the town DJ, our town crier, with the booming music.
I can't hear a thing.
Oh,
I can't hear a thing. But there's something about the way the work, I think your work is a kind of, it takes away the monumentality of the colonial archive. You're doing that work in a different kind of way. But I think it is very much akin to the writers and the thinkers that you have found synergy with. And Audre Lorde is one, and of course, Trio is another. Because I think for him, we haven't read that passage yet, but for him, he understood the power of the landscape and and history, and how that landscape holds history, and it's a history that we need to engage with and not be afraid of. Can you?
yeah, a good place to read that one. Michelle Grove Trio is a Haitian historian and thinker, whose book Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History is something that, it's transformed my way of thinking and making as an artist. And I would love to have someone read a passage from his work.
You have to choose.
Yeah, I have to pick someone.
Hypnotize someone.
Mike. All right.
Go, Mike.
Yeah. Um,
Hi everybody. Silence is already inherent in history because any single event enters history with all of its constituting part. Something is always left out while something else is included. There is no perfect closure of any event. However, one chooses to define the boundaries of that event. Thus, whatever becomes fact does so with its inborn absences specific to its production. In other words, the very mechanism that make any historical reporting possible also ensure that historical facts are accurate. They reflect the differential control of the means of historical production at the very first ingredient that transforms an event into fact. Silences of this kind show the limits of strategies that apply a more accurate constitution of events, and therefore the production of a better history. Simply by an enlargement of the space. To be sure, the continuous enlargement of the physical boundaries of historical production is useful and necessary. The turn toward hitherto neglected sources, as in diaries and bodies, and the emphasis on unused facts, as in facts of gender, race, and class, facts of life cycle, facts of resistance, are path-breaking developments. Silencing the past, now in the production of history, to show the role we all.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I know that passage can be a little bit dense, but I think the things that most resonated with me is thinking about the other empirical evidence that he's talking about. Like, if we can understand that history in and of itself is always selected, that there's always absence in the present. So whatever we're presenting as a narrative, it means that there's always a whole bunch of other stories that we're chosen not to be selected, chosen not to be held. It kind of makes you realize that this is a process constantly of negotiation. It isn't static, it's something that can be challenged and transformed. And, you know, it's really an assemblage. And for me, thinking about these other the empirical base that we talked about, right? Other images, the other unused, I thought it was such an interesting phrase, the unused facts. And that would be things that, for me, it's like for example, it's a work that we haven't really talked about, but the piece that I did about Victor and Alberta, the two children that were taken from St. Croix, you know, they were children that were, when you're thinking about the archive and the production of history, there was as many as 10,000 people a day who went to see them in Denmark. But there's no image of them in the cages. What does that mean when you're thinking about a silence or like how an archive is constructed? So there's images of them, there's discussions of them, there's articles where it mentions the Queen gave them a coin and the Queen went to see them, but there's no image of that incredible violence that was committed upon them, right? Like they were put in these cages and exhibited for several weeks in Denmark. And then, of course, the even more incredible violence is that they were never returned to their families. They were put in orphanages. And for me, when I was thinking about the other empirical based evidence thought about this story was the fact that if I can acknowledge that the archive is inherently flawed, is this production of silences, that maybe that's not where I needed to look for their story. And so I chose to think about the fact that they were two children that grew up in Kurdistan, and that how could I connect to them in that reality of that this is the sunset that they saw this sunset, they said we see the sunset, they saw that landscape, They walked along those streets. They probably used that well to get water. They probably saw change, it looks like that. So I started to think a lot about how can I connect to them through that embodied memory that I know they had before they went to Denmark when they were just 4 and 6.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course I started to connect to other stories that we had shared and trying to retell their story in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that piece in particular was one of the first times I realized that I can actively turn away from the archive, the colonial archives, to create my own.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the video, although I'm talking about these children, I never show images of them in the ways that they were captured in the colonial archives, because the production of those images was so violent. I felt, yeah, that there's a particular power in kind of shunning that. And like, no, I'm not going to show that, but you're going to still connect to their story in a different way.
Excellent, excellent. We haven't talked, I have about just 2 more questions and a question for the audience. I actually want to see and hear from the audience, not right now, I'm going to give you some time to think about your experience in the landscape of St. Croix. Are there certain buildings, smells, spaces that trigger memories for you or notions of history for you? And I wonder if you could somehow share that at the end of our conversation. But for now, Lavon, can you talk a little bit about the film, the films that are in the show, and how this is a different medium? You're using cinema, but in a sense, it circles back to some of the same themes that really concern the body of work that's featured in this exhibition. I want tell us a little bit about how you came to do this work and the themes of the piece, particularly the one that's also on exhibition now in the United States at the African American Museum.
Yeah, thanks. So I just mentioned a little bit about the film that was in a smaller room, which is about the story about these 2 children from St. Croix who were taken to Denmark to be exhibited. It's called In a Place of Shadow. So it's kind of thinking about how my body, like both the shadows of the archive, but then like the shadow of history and the shadows of my own story, the individual, collective, and then our individual stories. But in this room is another work called Between the Dusk and Dawn, How to Navigate an Unsettled Empire. And that work comes out of a curatorial provocation, right? I was invited to participate in an exhibition in Philadelphia, an African American museum that was asking 20 artists around the US one very significant question, which is the sun rising or setting on the American democracy? And the fact that the reason this setting sun is because in Philadelphia, where the Constitution was first signed, George Washington was sitting in a chair that had an engraving of a sun, right? And Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention at the time, it was a very anxiety-producing process. There were many moments that didn't look like this was actually going to happen. And at the end, he said to George Washington, all this time I wasn't sure if the sun was rising or setting on the American project, but now after the Constitution was signed, I feel like it's rising. But that phrase of the rising sun has many different meanings for different people. Of course, the Negro National Anthem talks about the rising sun in a totally different way. And of course, here in the Virgin Islands, we have the so-called rising sun, the easternmost point of the United States empire. And that irony was not lost on me when you asked me to think about the curatorial intention of the show. And so I decided that it would be very interesting to film the sunrise at Point Udall, and then very quickly in doing the research, I learned that there was another Point Udall in Guam. which is the westernmost point of the American Empire. And I was like, this is just too, I mean, it's so perfect in terms of kind of constructing a metaphor, right? And then when you're thinking about the manifest destiny and these ideas of expansionism, that the United States had to like go from sea to sea and even out into the sea. But then what does that mean when you're thinking about the actual realities of people living in these, you know, the euphemism is territories, but we're still colonies.
Yeah.
And so that work is me navigating, juxtaposing the mythology of the United States and what it says about itself with this myth a very quick myth that I talk about on Easter time here on Good Friday that you're not supposed to put in the ocean on Friday. And kind of juxtaposing those, you know, the visual of this like expansive scenes of these the landscape with this story. And then the second part of the video is, which you're not actually really sure. I don't think we know that it's the second part, but in Vaughn, the second part of the video. And I traveled 10,000 miles to go there, and that experience was totally wild because Vaughn is so far. You know, it made me think about you know, Magellan, right? Another one of these explorers that we all learn about in grade school and how he died on that voyage. I can see why he died. I mean, it is so hard. It is so hard. It is 8 hours to the very next thing by plane. So imagine my boat. So by plane, it's Hawaii on one side, and the other it's Korea, I think, Japan.
Oh, Japan. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's these group of islands in the Pacific Ocean that Guam in particular is the largest of the chain, and it's totally taken over by American armed forces. So much so that when I tried to film Point Yukon and I was writing to videographers, they didn't know what I was talking about. And not because it's a place that's remote that people don't know, it's because there's so many parts of the land that have been taken over by American armed forces that they no longer have access to. So then these places become forgotten in memory. So people don't even know that the land exists because they don't have access to it anymore. And I was so fascinated by that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating because you how can I put it? You illuminate something that most of us never think about. We think about the United States being from Maine in the east, you know, Key West in the south, and somewhere maybe in Oregon as the furthest western point, or Washington D.C. What you have done through that work is reorient us, just in the process of the work, to an aspect of America that isn't even known to us today. Many of us today, no one thinks of St. Croix being a part of the United States, or Guam being a part of the United States. It has, or Puerto Rico, or any, you know, they are liminal spaces, not quite. They're U.S., but not quite. It's an interesting space to illuminate through work. But I know we're going long now. But I have one last question for you before we open it up to questions. And I want to see if anyone can answer me regarding points of memory in the crucial in the landscape in St. Croix. But one of the things I've admired is your insistence on working in the Caribbean, of, you know, just making sure that your practice is based there. And it can't be easy. It can't be, but you have managed to do that, and you've also managed to cultivate a community of people, of like-minded professors and fellow thinkers. And I want, for those of us who don't know about the collective that you formed, can you tell us a little bit about that, and how the collective with you know, you and your colleagues have come together to work and consider St. Croix as a site? that grounds your research and your practice. How did that evolve, and what has that, in a sense, given you as an artist over the last few years of, in community?
Thanks. Thank you for asking that question because I think, I know some people might look at me and wonder like, how do you do this? And it is not, of course, by myself. It's there are lots of champions and collaborators and people that I work with, and one of them is the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, and we were formed in 2017-18, really at the 100-year anniversary of the transfer from Denmark to the United States, where you would think that in a centennial anniversary that's thinking about a transfer from one colonial power to the other, you might think first about the 100 years that just passed. But most of that year really thought about the rupture of the 250 years that were being ended. Meaning that we focus much more about our Danish colonial history than our US. And so during that year, I spent a lot of time in Denmark. I was invited to a lot of different exhibitions. And one of the projects that I was a part of was a film that a Danish professor did called We Carry It Within Us. And she had interviewed other Virgin Islanders, women in the film, and invited them all to Denmark for the premiere. And I knew these women. It was Tiffany Anique, who's a writer, Dr. Tanya Yamura, who's an anthropologist. And so as we're in probably Denmark for a week together, and we're going around to all these huge exhibitions that all these Danish institutions are having, and they're finally bringing out the archives, the famous archives that we have not seen for hundreds of years. And with each exhibition, I mean, you're seeing all these photographs and objects and spears and nails and whips and all kinds of things. It was so painful. It was so painful because it's like we're looking at ourselves, but it's not us. Because it's not told by us, it's not told in our voices, the framing was off. And we all looked at each other at each exhibition and was just like, what would we have done with these same objects, same images, same things, and what are the stories we would have told? And by the end of that journey, we looked at each other and we're like, well, we should try it. Like, what's stopping us? And so that started us wanting to work together to do this kind of memory work, archival work, and interdisciplinary work. And it was very much centered on Black feminist practice of collaboration and working together. So we've been doing a lot of projects over the last few years, and that's deeply impacted and informed my work. And you also commented on kind of this question of, a lot of artists from the region leave because there's so many more opportunities in the States and in Europe. And I have been very determined to stay because I make work about, I think the Caribbean is one of the most important parts of the world. I mean, every major civilization crosses here. Why would I make work? To me, it's like, this is the place where I want to be making my work. So, as many of you that know me, I do travel, of course, a lot, and I'm engaged. My practice is very engaged with the outside world, but it's very important for me.
That's wonderful. That's a great place to end this portion, I think, of the conversation. And should we open it up now for questions, Lavon?
Yeah, I think we have some time because we're running over a little late, so if we start out, so we can have a couple questions. First, or comments, Julia? Anyone?
I just want to say I appreciate the comment about the various point of view dolls and the space Virgin Islands and the U.S. Empire. And when we describe the Virgin Islands for our friends in the States, we always describe it as the edge of the American Empire, where it's like it's almost the U.S., except when it doesn't. And I live in Washington, D.C., so we also know something about what's going on in the U.S. that are outside the U.S. Wonderful.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
I just want to say thank you. I was born and raised here, moved back about a year and a half ago, and the word that just even the question about what it means to really want to be here and really work hard to make a community and do your work here, it's inspiring to me, and I really feel that it's
Here's the idea that called sapiens. And they were talking about the sapiens appeared on the scene, and they were confronting the Neanderthals. And they were smaller species. And there were many of them. And yet they were able to pass really the Neanderthals, and they were still the ascendant species. What they discussed in the book was the power that the sapiens had over the Neanderthals, the single most distinguishing element. And I just throw the idea out there, think about it at some point. But their most significant talent and power, in that sense, was their ability to create fiction.
Do you have any comments? I think it's very, did you hear that? Did you hear that, Erica?
No, I couldn't hear it.
Okay, Mike commented on the book Sapiens, and how as the Sapiens and the Neanderthals were kind of existing at a similar time, the reason why the Sapiens surpassed them was because of their ability to create fiction.
Nice.
Yeah, and so I think, I think, again, some of the things I've been saying, I just like that is essence of who we are as well. Everything, everything from the power of gratitude, affirmation, the way that we face challenges, that's kind of who we are as a species. We're a narrative species. We tell stories, and that's how we exist and navigate the world. It makes me think a lot about even my father, who was a priest, but he was also my comparative religion teacher in school. He was the leader of the Interfaith Coalition here for a long time. And he really did believe, he said, what is the unifying factor of humanity is that 90-something% believe that there's some kind of higher power and it creates a narrative around it. And he, really instilled in me this belief that nobody's narrative around this higher power is better than anyone else's.
Yeah,
exactly.
By putting words
yeah.
into our narrative.
Yeah.
And many of the narratives
and
obfuscate what could be the truth. Finding actual truth is the difficult thing.
Yeah.
When the reality, especially when you look at it historically, it's complicated.
even when you think about what is the historical point of view, what is, if we just talk about how that even that, like to say it's a historical point of view as a way of signifying a truth, we understand that history in itself is a fiction, right? It's a creation of these different silences. So I think, I mean, as I mentioned with my father, thinking about religion, that's just another way of us trying to understand sometimes what's unknowable. So these are the stories that we create about it, and so he always had a very, I don't know if you would call that maybe intellectual, but a more open-minded view about religion. And I think that deeply informed me. Like when I think a lot about the fact that, the Bible is one of the oldest archives in the world. That's a collection of these stories. And I listen to my father every Sunday, my whole life, reimagine that archive to fit our context. That's what he did. So he would talk about the stories of Peter and Paul, but then talk about Mr. Rathway down the road who did that. It was always a reimagining of these stories that are, were millennia old. So I think that also deeply informed my practice when I think about like the ways of approach things. And I think you're really dying. Do we have any other comments or questions? Yes, there's one.
So I wanted to and growing up with but this love for the island and it was a strange island that I love. And this idea that in order to make it right, you have to be. So when 11th grade and 12th grade, there was a part of choice. It was and it wasn't just me alone. I think that's just part of it. But it took me even traveling and seeing the world, really reconnecting and appreciating just what it is that I. So my question is, what I don't know if you thought about this, but for those kids who was me 50 years ago, what is it that we get to tell them so that they can appreciate what they have? And look, I'm all for track, we'll try to support it, but appreciate what you have. I know as much as I love St. I was leaving St. Croix because by the time I was in the 12th grade, it was just, the stakes is there. So only if you have anything of that. What if we take our kids now, help them love and appreciate it?
I don't know if you heard the question, Erica, but he asked me basically to think about what would I say to young people on St. Croix now to inspire them to want to stay, because we're kind of raised here, and probably, I don't know if it's the same way in the Bahamas, but you're kind of raised to leave. You're not really raised to stay. I think we have such an incredible community here. You know what I found? This is something that I found interesting, like thinking about some of the themes of the show and just the aspect of a hurricane. There are a lot of, like in the States, when they have hurricanes, everybody tries to leave. And, they're trying to escape. And for me, I want to be home. I was telling somebody, I want to be home. And not just because I'm trying to look out for my property or anything like that. It's actually the aftermath of the storm, which is what I wanted to experience. Because if you've ever experienced the aftermath of a storm and what happens here, that is the essence of why you stay. People go and check on their elderly neighbors, they help each other, people jump on boats to go to other islands, help people. It's the essence of, it's the depth of who we are that comes out. And I think that growing up in like a small island and a community where people truly look out for each other because you kind of have to, because if you're being mean and mess up to somebody, you're gonna have to see them in the office the next week or the next week or the next month when you need something from them. So, or, we have the CIA or Curator Intelligence Agency, that's just like 2 phone calls and we know everything you need to know about somebody. I think those are the things that, I too, when I was, 16, 17, decided I wanted to leave, to have a different experience. But like even now as an artist, Erica and I, we've talked a lot about that. She's like, what about, going to the States or to Europe, your career is so perfectly positioned for that, that you would do so much. And I think about my studio in Christiansted, I think about because it's not family really that keeps me here. My parents are both done, so it's just me here and my children. But it's something about my memories of, like, kind of what you said, my memories of growing up here that kind of have bound me here in a way. That I feel, that I feel committed to this place because of that.
Wow.
I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything. I don't know if you wanted to wrap up and say anything.
No, I think if no one else has any immediate comments, I just think spread the word about the show. We really want people to come in and see it. If you have time, we wanted to do a walkthrough. Vaughn said she would be willing to, I don't know, take you through really quickly and talk about individual works. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to have this conversation in person with Vaughn and you, but thanks for showing up and listening to us. I really
Thank you. Thank you again for doing this with me. This was like such an incredible experience. I wanted to also say the show is going to be up until January 15th, and this is the first, which is a catalog for my work. It's going to be produced at the Korean Museum Center as so generously is producing. I should be available at the beginning of next year. We have another event that's going to be a part of the show. It's with another collective that I'm a part of. It's loosely called Reparative Encounters, but it's been inspired by this idea that, like for example, when I went to Guam, there's a line I say that comes from a decolonial activist that I met when I was there. And he's so busy, he's so renowned, he's like the curator of the National Museum in Guam, all these different organizations. And he took the time to meet with me. And when I mentioned it to my videographers, they were like, "How did you get a meeting with him?" So I asked him in this diner that we met, and I was like, "What did they tell you specifically? I'm so grateful that you chose to meet with me." And he said, "We were never meant to meet." He said, "I've never met anyone from the Virgin Islands. We were never meant to meet." And that was so powerful. There was this idea of like colonialism intentionally separates and divides us, and the power in our encounters, right? And so this collective that I'm a part of is based on Danish colonialism and people who've been impacted by Danish colonialism. So it's artists from Greenland that are going to be here, artists from Ghana, artists from Denmark, and another collaborator who's from Portugal. So they're going to be here on January. They're going to be here for a week, and so we'll be out and about, doing different things, but they're going to be here on January 5th, talking a little bit about their work and engaging with the show and talking about our collective and, that power kind of decentering Denmark, but recentering ourselves. So we actually have been spending time in each other's countries. So we were in Greenland a few months ago, so they're all coming here, and then we're going to be going to Ghana in 2024, and that will be on January 5th at the same time, 6:30, 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, 6 to 8 on January 5th.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
I just once again would like to thank all of you, but also Erica, thank you so much for taking the time for this project for as a whole on the whole. Your contribution to the catalog, taking the time to be with us this evening, I really appreciate it. The conversation was invigorating. I hope you will join us again on January 5th for the next iteration of the competition. And thank you again for being with us. Appreciate you.
Thank you.